Thank you. And so the show goes on. We have two more speakers this evening. Our first speaker is Dr. Alan Parkinson. Alan needs no introduction to this audience. He spoke on the Ulster crisis some weeks ago in the Ulster Museum. Alan is a native of Belfast who studied at Queen's University. He lectured in history at the University of London South Bank, is the author of a number of recent books on conflict in Ireland, including 1972, looking at the development of the crisis that ends with the fall of Stormont and indeed Bloody Friday that year. He's written a book on Belfast, on holy wars. He's co-edited with me a book on conflicts in the north of Ireland, and his new book, Friends in High Places, looking at the role of the British establishment in supporting Ulster in these years, is due to be published in the next few months, and there is a flyer out there. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Alan Parkinson.
Hello. My brief tonight is to talk about the conflict, what I described in my book as the forgotten conflict of the 1920s. Obviously, this is a major topic. I've only got 15 to 20 minutes, so you'll be conscious of the fact that all I'm probably will be able to do tonight will be to give you a kind of an insight, a brief insight, a taster, really, I suppose, of this 2-year conflict. I've described it as Shipyard Confetti. Some of you will probably know what that is getting at. It's referring to the rivets and the bolts and which were thrown at mainly Catholic and also socialist shipyard workers at the time of during this particular conflict in the early 1920s. Okay, holy wars and Belfast are sadly not a recent combination. Sectarian disturbances have been a constant feature of the city's modern history, but probably the most concentrated and overtly sectarian outburst of violence occurred during the pivotal period of Irish partition. As Eamon mentioned, around 500 people lost their lives, thousands more were injured, and considerable damage was inflicted upon the city's commercial centre between 1920 and 1922. Before my book, Belfast and the Holy War, was published in 2004, this neglected and misunderstood area of Irish historiography had not been the subject of a detailed, impartial study, and interpretations of the violence had been largely, I think, one-dimensional. For instance, the labelling of this conflict as one of state-induced pogroms misrepresents the involvement of the new Northern administration, which, although undeniably weak-willed, lethargic, and largely reactive in its response, arguably did not orchestrate a systematic campaign of violence, which I would suggest is implicit in the term pogrom. Rather, the violence owed its distinctive nature to the fusion of several distinct separate factors, including prevalent degrees of deep sectarian tension in the city, troubles elsewhere in Ireland, which Eamon was talking about, impending political and constitutional changes, and the perceived threat posed by a truculent neighbour. This short talk will look briefly at the origins of the city's violence, their political backdrop, the presence of external threats and the internal responses to these dangers, the pattern of violence in the Belfast area, and if I've got time, a brief look at what it was like to grow up in the city during this dangerous time. First of all, the origins of the conflict, and again, some of this has been touched on by the previous speaker. There had been previous bouts of sectarian violence in Belfast, including, as I mentioned in the previous talk, 1886 and to a lesser extent in 1912, which were, of course, both periods of Home Rule crisis. In the early summer of 1920, the Anglo-Irish War was still raging in the rest of Ireland, and there were serious sectarian disturbances in Derry, which actually resulted in over 40 deaths. Although most of Ulster was not directly affected by the conflict elsewhere in Ireland, many serving officers in the RIC, including some killed or injured on duty, came from the north. including 2 high-profile police officers killed by the IRA, Gerald Smith in Cork and Oswald Swansea in Lisburn. Tension was high in Belfast during the summer of 1920, especially following the murder of Smith and a fiery Orange Day speech delivered by Sir Edward Carson. On the first working day after the 12th holiday, trouble erupted in the city's shipyards. Hardline elements forced Catholic workers from their work posts with physical attacks. They included the throwing, as I've described, of shipyard confetti, a variety of iron nuts, bolts, and rivets, and verbal threats employed to achieve this goal. There were similar instances of intimidation and violence in several other industries and factories, and an estimated 10,000 Catholics and a smaller number of socialists were forced out of their jobs. Street disturbances erupted within hours of the evictions as loyalist workers made their homeward journeys. Trams were attacked as they passed Short Strand in the east of the city, and there were soon reported disturbances in the markets and in the south of the city centre and York Street areas. Catholic properties, especially pubs and spirit groceries, were attacked, notably in the east of the city, and evictions of people, predominantly but not exclusively Catholics, from their homes started within days of the industrial evictions. Over 20,000 Catholics, as Eamon mentioned, an estimated 20 to 25% of the total population in Belfast, incidentally, demographics are very different then compared with today, were believed to have been intimidated from their homes, with some not returning. And this added considerably to prevalent overcrowding in areas like the Falls district, the already densely populated Falls district. This particular slide I've got up here, which some of you may be familiar with, shows trouble in the little street, which I know quite well, Little George Street, which links up the York Street area with a nationalist North Queen Street to the north of Belfast city centre. This is 1922. There had been IRA sniper activity in the area when the police was coming through here. Okay, political backdrop to the violence. And again, I'll just touch on refer briefly to what Eamon was mentioning. There was, as we have seen, an unprecedented degree of political change in the form of legislation and ongoing vital negotiations, which resulted in increased fears amongst both communities. Leadership of the Ulster Unionists, as was mentioned, was to pass from the hands of the veteran Sir Edward Carson to those of his lieutenant, James Craig. Craig was inheriting a party which was now very much on its own. And this has come out in the book I've just written here. There wasn't the same degree of open support for Ulster Unionists in 1920 as there had been in, say, 1912. And one which was increasingly isolated and under threat. If anything, Northern Catholics were even more marginalised and isolated. Led by nationalist leader Joe Devlin, both the UIL and Sinn Féin, again has been mentioned, fared badly in the partition election of May 1921. And there was a clear perception that the Catholic community, within the Catholic community, that nationalist leaders elsewhere in Ireland were prepared to ditch them in an attempt to consolidate their own political future. The Government of Ireland Act became law just before Christmas in 1920. Designed by Lord George, it was based on the principle of self-determination, which had been the hallmark of the Versailles Conference of 1919, and was considered to be the solution to Ireland's political problems. Limited powers of self-government were given to the two new parliaments in Belfast and Dublin, with both Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State subservient to Westminster and retaining their place within the British Empire. Eamon's mentioned the elections to the Northern Parliament. He mentioned all 40 Unionist candidates were returned, along with 6 nationalists and 6 Sinn Féin members. There were complaints, of course, at this time of intimidation at several polling stations in the city, but the overwhelming nature of the Unionist victory could not be disputed. George V made a quick visit to Belfast in June to formally open the new Parliament at Belfast's City Hall. It actually moved, as some of you know, within a year to where I was actually speaking at the conference at Queen's last week, at the Union Theological College, where it remained for a decade before moving to Stormont in the east of the city, I think in 1932. The King George V received a warm welcome from Ulster Loyalists in June 21, although he was cold-shouldered by the city's nationalist residents. In his speech opening a new parliament, and Eamon's quoted a bit from that, the King implored, "I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards the end of strife amongst her people, whatever their race or creed. In that hope, I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and forget, and to join in the making for the land they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill." Eamon mentioned how this has got links with modern day speeches. It's also, to me, it's got very much the words of Lloyd George are contained in here, and the hand of Lloyd George is all over that particular speech. Tight security prevented serious violence during the royal visit, although a train transporting soldiers and horses was attacked near the border in South Armagh a few days later. The IRA's truce with the British next month was aimed at facilitating political negotiation. As war in the north continued, there was an uneasy peace in the south. Before Christmas, we heard, Michael Collins reluctantly signed the treaty in London's Downing Street, leading to a split within Sinn Féin and the IRA. And Collins, of course, famously conceded that he had just signed his own death warrant. And this led, of course, to an even bloodier civil war, even bloodier than the Anglo-Irish War. It was this internecine conflict involving, as it did, the relocation of IRA personnel, as well as the Northern Administration's successes in the security area, which ultimately led to the petering out of the 3rd Northern Division's campaign. And incidentally, I would recommend the work of Jim McDermott. Jim's here tonight, and his work which looked at the 3rd Northern Division. External threats and internal responses, just to look at this. Apart from the indirect impact of war in Southern Ireland upon Northern Security Force families, the economic boycott, the Belfast boycott mentioned earlier, which operated in practice from the late summer of 1920 until the middle of 1922, dampened the mood of Northern Loyalists and made them even more reluctant to compromise. The IRA monitored this boycott. They boarded northbound trains, they confiscated and destroyed Northern goods, and encouraged Southerners not to use Northern-based banks. There was some disruption to financial trading, and some, mainly smaller firms, were damaged. But as most of Belfast's trade was conducted with Britain or further afield, it would be the psychological damage of the Belfast boycott which was to be even greater than its financial impact. On account of the British military being tied down elsewhere in the island, there was an enlargement of the local police force, with the raising of a special constabulary and in June 1922, the establishment, of course, of the RUC. The specials, there were three. I haven't really got time to talk about it now, but there were three different types of specials. The B specials, of course, in particular, were unpopular with Catholics. And there were also several individual rogue policemen, or rogue cops, as I've called them, who were strongly suspected of being involved in a number of sectarian attacks. And I'll come back to that in a second, and also in the questions if there's time. On account of the escalation of violence during the first part of 1922, James Craig sanctioned draconian legislation in order to address the worsening security situation. Measures included the Special Powers Act in April, which gave the local administration powers to detain suspects at a prison ship, the Argenta, just like the Maidstone in the early part of the modern Northern Ireland conflict. Emergency courts were established, and internment was introduced following the shooting of Unionist MP William Twaddell in May 1922. Initially, these measures were applied exclusively to nationalists, although as the Republican threat ceased, or was nipped in the bud, they would also be applied to loyalist paramilitaries. These extreme measures were, in security terms, if not their lasting legacy, undoubtedly successful, though what had been designed as being temporary would remain in place for many years to come. This is just a slide of sea specials in East Belfast. The patterns of violence, the central feature of the violence was its intermittent but intense nature, concentrated as it was in a relatively short period of time, just over 2 years. There were particularly bad spells of violence at various times during this period, especially during the first half of 1922, when around half of the conflict's fatalities occurred. There were close to 70 fatalities in May 1922 alone. Sniping attacks were common and relatively easy to execute, given the dense concentration of IRA attacks on members of the security forces, politicians, and ordinary Protestants. Some of these took place in crowded city centre streets and caused considerable excitement and panic. This is a shooting in central Belfast. This is the police searching bypasses in the minutes and hours following the assassination of William Trudell. The other type of sniping attacks involved rogue policemen and loyalists, and I'll come back to that in a second. A second feature of the violence was bombing attacks, which were mainly, but not exclusively, the work of Republicans. The IRA bombed several workers' trams and also targeted businesses and commercial premises, causing £3 million worth of damage, which is probably closer to 150 million damaged pounds today. Many of these attacks, like this one on a commercial property in the docks area of the city, were spontaneous and unplanned. They were often executed in response to atrocities from the other side. For example, loyalist gangs revenging the killing of police by attacking Catholics, or the IRA avenging killings of Catholics by Protestants or road cops. As far as victims of violence were concerned, Catholics were more likely than Protestants to be involved, with casualties in nationalist areas constituting over 60% of the total. And bear in mind, of course, the smaller overall Catholic population, percentage of the population. However, this disproportionate number of Catholic victims does not mean that violence was simply and exclusively one-sided. Despite their internal weaknesses and uncertainties, the IRA posed a considerable and genuine threat to the security forces. There were also numerous attacks by the IRA on ordinary Protestants, which I would argue turns on its head the whole Pilgrim thesis. There was certainly a class factor. Most victims of the violence were working class, and you can make the comparison with the modern conflict in the 70s and 80s particularly. Although a small number of businessmen were also targeted. The majority of the victims were the unarmed and the innocent, often the young, with nearly a third of all fatalities being under 21. Many of those targeted for attack were done so because of their religion, or because they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And again, this has got resonance for us today. Moving around a district, especially at night, was a danger. Carters, pedestrians, and onlookers were especially prone to snipers and bombers. My book looked at all the major security incidents in the city between 1920 and 22, and I'll just mention 3 of them here. The Weaver Street attack, the 13th of February 1922, took place in a nationalist enclave of North Belfast. A revenge attack for a local Protestant. A bomb was lobbed into this street where Catholic children were playing street games. Well over 20 were injured, including 6 fatally. A few months before this, on the 24th of November 1921, one of several attacks on workers' trams occurred, with the destination of the tram clearly marked at the front. And this also, incidentally, gave a pretty good indication of the likely religion of the passengers. The IRA lobbed a bomb onto the Shankill tram in the city's central Berry Street district. Nearly 30 were injured, including 4 fatally. And of course, the most infamous, and I have a section in my book on this, the most infamous of all the attacks of the 20s Troubles was, as I've argued in the book, probably carried out by rogue cops off the Antrim Road on the 23rd of March 1922. The male members of Owen McMahon's family, McMahon was a rich Catholic publican, plus a lodger who also was his bar manager, were singled out for shooting after men in uniform forced entry into their Kinnaird Terrace mansion. Mr. McMahon was, as I said, a successful publican. He and 4 of his sons, plus his lodger, were shot dead and another seriously wounded. These family killings, motivated by the IRA killing of police officers early in that day, caused particular revulsion. And questions were asked in Parliament. The shootings also incidentally led to a second agreement between Collins and James Craig. And just finally, I'd like to look at what it was like to grow up in the Troubles. As I've mentioned already, there were considerable dangers facing children as they played in the streets, as they went to school, or else simply being attacked at their home. Several of the people I talked to about 10 years ago, or even more than that, had strong memories of the police, the army, and the gunmen firing from street corners. They had memories of the army patrolling the streets or manning barricades like this one on North Street. Taking IRA prisoners. This one is, you probably can recognize at the old Opera House and Great Victoria Street. And this was after a shooting of IRA members. They remember things like this obviously very well. Stories of vicious gunfire being directed into neighbouring streets, rogue policemen pulling suspects out of bed and beating or even shooting them abounded in Catholic districts. One respondent recalled the roar of the crowd as police marksmen picked off a, incidentally, loyalist rooftop sniper. And another recalled being informed one morning that his teacher, an IRA volunteer, had been shot the previous evening, one of the Duffins. Getting to school was a constant problem, with stone throwing and name calling common, and police were often asked to provide escorts. Even on occasion, schools could be attacked. And this slide shows the old model school, which was then in West Belfast, which was the victim of an arson attack in 1922. Some experienced the excitement which went with living in police or fire stations on account of their father's job. One respondent lived at Whitler Street fire station, which not only saw fire engines rushing out to extinguish flames brought on by explosions or arson attacks, but which were also used as temporary mortuaries. Youngsters, however, realized they had to get on with life, enjoying themselves but trying at the same time to remember not to take too many risks. Now, I'll just end with a quote from one of the many delightful people I interviewed for this book. Nearly all of them, sadly, are no longer with us. This particular one is, some of you may know him, Jimmy Kelly, who was a very distinguished journalist here for many years. And Jimmy told me, he also wrote about this in his book, about a Saturday morning tram journey at the height of the 20s Troubles. Now, I'll just end with this. The old red and yellow coloured tram cars swayed, whined and groaned over the rails down the Falls Road. There were certain danger points when it passed Cooper Street, Conway Street, Northumberland Street and Dover Street, long streets leading from the Falls to the Shankill. Across these streets, at moments of tension, the report of rifle fire rang out as snipers on both sides opened up. The tram speeded and clanked past these streets as the driver crouched down on the deck behind the controls. The passengers, they took their cue and huddled down on the floor, which the tram yards department had thoughtfully provided with a carpet of straw. There were always audible sighs of relief when the neutral Castle Junction came into sight. Thank you. And just two final slides I forgot to show you there. I mentioned children what it's like for children in Belfast, and this one, Shipyard Confetti of a different sort. Some beautiful photographs, which incidentally, all of these, nearly all of these, were and are in the Belfast Telegraph's photograph archive. And if you contact Paul Carson, I'm sure he might be able to show you them. Okay, thank you.